Between the 1870s and the beginning of World War I, black pioneers settled more than 100 all-black towns in the West, each with the goal of economic independence. But they were all destroyed.
Residents, community officials, and civil rights leaders spent this day in Tulsa, Oklahoma, marking the 100th anniversary of the race massacre in the city's Greenwood district. That neighborhood, once among the most prosperous for Black Americans, was known as Black Wall Street. White mobs killed many Black residents and left the neighborhood in smoldering ruins.
Throughout the mayhem, thousands of Black Tulsans were rounded up and confined to fairgrounds and ball fields. The National Guard imposed martial law on June 1st. Thereafter, Black citizens were required to carry identity cards. The rampage lasted an estimated 16 hours. It ended on the evening of June 1st with more than 35 square blocks of the district destroyed. 10,000 Black people were left homeless and destitute. Hundreds were injured. The precise number of dead is unknown.
We are not over yet with Black cities that got destroyed by whites. They are numerous, far more than you may have known. Throughout history, there have been numerous instances where vibrant and prosperous Black communities were targeted and destroyed, often due to racial tensions, economic jealousy, or systemic racism.
Hundreds fled to towns around Tulsa or to other states. We also know that there were those who were murdered and buried in mass graves. The third group were those who were taken and put into internment camps. So this is what happened to the Black community, and one has to stop and think what that means. The devastation of losing your home, your business, family members, and then to walk out of these internment camps and have to rebuild.
African Americans have been violently expelled from at least 50 towns, cities, and counties in the United States. Most of these expulsions occurred in the 60 years following the Civil War, but continued until 1954. The justifications for the expulsions varied, but often involved a crime committed by white Americans, labor-related issues, or property takeovers. But the truth is, the destruction caused never attracted reparations, nor any deserved justice due it. Instead, the victims were blamed.
Despite the unprecedented horrors of May 31st and June 1st, no perpetrators were charged or tried. Indeed, the victimized community was blamed.
After the massacre, a grand jury made of 12 white men appointed by the governor indicted a number of Black citizens for the massacre, the riot, they called it, and some whites as well. But in the end, the grand jury effectively blamed it on the Black community.
Welcome to the second episode of Prosperous Black Cities That Got Destroyed by Whites. It's important to shed light on these dark chapters of history to better understand the struggles and resilience of Black communities. Before we continue, don't forget to support our persistent efforts to fill you in by hitting that like button on your screen. Share with families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to keep the channel growing. Your support means a lot to us. Red Summer of 1919. This uprising was one of several incidents of civil unrest that began in the so-called American Red Summer of 1919. The summer consisted of terrorist attacks on Black communities and white oppression in over 36 cities and counties. In most cases, white mobs attacked African American neighborhoods. In some cases, Black community groups resisted the attacks, especially in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Most deaths occurred in rural areas during events like the Elaine race riot in Arkansas, where an estimated 100 to 240 Black people and 5 white people were killed. Also occurring in 1919 were the Chicago race riot and Washington, D.C. race riot, which killed 38 and 39 people respectively, and with both having many more non-fatal injuries and extensive property damage reaching up into millions of dollars. Some of these cities mentioned we've already briefly discussed in the first segment of this video. Others we are going to be looking at now. 1. Pierce City, Missouri, 1901. A candlelight memorial service for the African Americans killed in the race riot in Pierce City in 1901 was held only months ago, August 19th, on a Saturday by 9 p.m. It was held in the parking lot of City Hall in Pierce City, Walnut, and Commercial Streets, where the lynching of Will Godley took place. The program, or anniversary rather, was meant to hold for a solemn hour, as those who attended were asked to come with their candles and lawn chairs. They would listen to the local historian and journalist Murray Bischoff recount the sad story of the memorable outbreak in Pierce City, Missouri, 1901. More than a dozen lynchings are recorded in southwest Missouri, with 4 considered by historians to have driven out black families: Monet in 1894, Pierce City in 1901, Joplin in 1903, and Springfield in 1906. On August 19, 1901, a large white mob took 3 African-American men from jail in Pierce City and lynched them. French and William Godley and Peter Hampton were suspects in the murder of a young white woman. 2 of the men were quite aged and were unlikely suspects. None had a chance at a trial. Unrest continued, and the white mob burned 5 black homes and drove 30 families into the woods, affecting the roughly 300 black residents in the town. It had about 1,000 white residents. Most of the African Americans lost all their land and property. Whites simply took over the empty properties. This was part of a pattern of violence in southwest Missouri in the early 20th century. 2. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. The Wilmington coup of 1898 was a violent overthrow of the city's biracial government by white supremacists. In November of the aforementioned years, a white supremacist mob stormed the majority black and racially integrated city of Wilmington, North Carolina, and burned the office of a black newspaper. They marauded through the streets, burning down homes and businesses, killing as many as 100 black residents. The mayhem was all part of a carefully planned effort to overthrow the local government, which included black aldermen and other officials and civil servants. It still stands as the only successful coup in American history, a coup which was motivated by white fears of black political power and economic advancement. Black residents retreated into swamps and woods on the outskirts of town to escape the white mob and never returned. Around 2,000 left for good, leaving the city majority white. 3. Atlanta, Georgia, 1906. Between September 24 and September 26, 1906, white mobs killed dozens of black Atlantans, wounded scores of others, and inflicted considerable property damage. Known thereafter as the Atlanta Race Riot, the event was one of a series of violent conflagrations that erupted in southern cities during the dawn of the Jim Crow era. On the noon of September 22, Atlanta newspapers reported 4 alleged assaults on local white women, none of which were ever substantiated. In a series of extra editions published throughout the day, the papers added lurid details and ever more inflammatory language, and soon thousands of white men and boys gathered downtown in protest. City leaders, including Mayor James G. Woodward, sought to calm the increasingly indignant crowds, but failed to do so. By early evening, the crowd had become a mob. From then until after midnight, they surged down Decatur Street, Pryor Street, Central Avenue, and throughout the Central Business District, assaulting hundreds of blacks and destroying black-owned businesses. The crowd also attacked streetcars, entering trolley cars, and assaulting black men and women. Finally, the militia was summoned around midnight, and streetcar service was suspended. The mob showed no signs of letting up, however, and the crowd was dispersed only once. A heavy rain began to fall around 2 a.m. in the morning. Atlanta was then under the control of the state militia. 4. Ocoee, Florida, 1920. The Ocoee destruction of 1920 was a racially motivated attack on the predominantly black town of Ocoee, Florida. The attack was intended to prevent black citizens from voting. Poll taxes had been imposed as de facto disenfranchisement in Florida since the beginning of the 20th century. In Ocoee and across the state, various black organizations had been conducting voter registration drives for a year. In November 1920, Mose Norman, a prosperous African-American farmer, tried to vote but was turned away twice after refusing to pay the poll tax on Election Day. Norman was among those working on the voter drive. Rightfully angered, he returned armed with a shotgun and threatened poll workers several times, so much so that there was a warrant out for his arrest. Later that day, some white Ocoee residents were deputized by Orange County Sheriff Deputy Clyde Pounds and charged with arresting Julius July Perry and Mose Norman. They surrounded the home of Julius Perry, where Mose Norman was thought to have taken refuge. In the process of attempting to arrest Perry, 2 white men were killed and others wounded, although the perpetrators were never identified. Perry and his 19-year-old daughter Caretha were also wounded by gunfire. Reinforcements from Orlando and Orange County were called upon, contributing to a mob that laid waste to the African American community in northern Ocoee, and eventually lynching Perry, who was in custody at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, shooting and taking his body to Orlando, where he was hanged from a light post to intimidate other black people. Norman escaped, never to be found. Hundreds of other African Americans fled the town, leaving behind their homes and possessions. By most estimates, a total of 30 to 80 black people were killed during what has been considered the single bloodiest day in modern American political history. Most African American owned buildings and residences in northern Ocoee were burned to the ground. Other African Americans living in southern Ocoee were later killed or driven out of town by the threat of further violence being used against them. Thus, Ocoee essentially became an all-white or sundown town. 5. Forsyth County, Georgia, 1912. In Forsyth County, Georgia, in September 1912, 2 separate alleged attacks on white women in the Cumming area resulted in black men being accused as suspects. First, on the 5th of September, a white woman named Ellen Grice reportedly awoke to find a black man in her bedroom. Then, days later, on the 8th of the same month, a teenage white woman named May Crow was found in secluded woods about 1 mile, that is, 1.6 kilometers, from her house, lying face down in a pool of blood, and her throat had been slashed. She was still alive and breathing shallowly, dying of her injury. Following the first alleged assault, a black preacher who made disparaging remarks about the victim was harshly beaten. Outraged whites horsewhipped the preacher until law officers rescued him and took him inside the courthouse. Other black men, arrested in connection with the alleged assault, were moved to Atlanta for their safety. Following the second alleged assault, a 16-year-old black boy was linked to the attack by a pocket mirror sold to him at a local store, which was found beside the white teenage girl. He confessed under duress and implicated accomplices. Rob Edwards was one of the men arrested and held in the small jail in Cumming. He was taken from the jail by a white mob and shot and beaten to death, and his body was hanged from a telephone pole. The 16-year-old and an alleged accomplice were later convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out weeks later in what became a public execution. In the following months, a group of men called Night Riders terrorized black citizens, warning them to leave in 24 hours or be killed. Those who resisted were subjected to further harassment, including shots fired into their homes or livestock killed. An estimated 98% of the black residents of Forsyth County left in fear of their lives, leaving their properties behind. 6. Memphis, 1866. The violent fracas called the 1866 Memphis race riots was the culmination of racial tensions that had grown since the federal occupation of the city in 1862. During the Civil War, African Americans seeking freedom and protection often relocated to federally occupied towns or established improvised camps near federal encampments. These refugees, called contrabands, often did labor for the federal army. Contrabands concentrated at Memphis swelled the African American population from 3,000 in 1865 to $20,000 by mid-1865. From this group, the 3rd Heavy Artillery was organized in 1863 and stationed at nearby Fort Pickering. Immediately after the war, a power struggle ensued between Memphis's civilian police force, mostly Irish immigrants, and black federal soldiers. Police brutality against Memphis blacks, especially soldiers, heightened to a fever pitch in 1865, but federal commanders had no authority to control or punish the police. Memphis press often exacerbated problems, portraying African Americans as violent, immoral drunks. Conditions worsened when African American soldiers' enlistment ended on April 30th, 1866. Waiting for their final pay, many veterans went into the city to celebrate. However, The celebration deteriorated to violence. About 3 p.m. on May 1st, white policemen arrested an African-American veteran for disturbing the peace. Roughly 50 uniformed African Americans witnessed the arrest and freed the man. The police returned in greater numbers and made more arrests. The veterans fired weapons into the air, and the police fired into the crowd. After a brief exchange of gunfire, the police carried off the detainees but returned with reinforcements. After another gunfight, roughly 150 veterans returned to Fort Pickering for safety. A group of police and local whites entered African American communities under the guise of searching for weapons. Vigilantes attacked innocent residents, killing indiscriminately men, women, and children, until martial law was declared. The riots ended with 46 African Americans and 2 whites dead, 5 rapes, 75 people shot, countless beatings, and 103 buildings destroyed, as 91 homes, 4 churches, and 8 schools burned. Riots like these dramatically increased national support for the 14th Amendment, securing United States citizenship for blacks nationwide. 7. York, Pennsylvania, 1969. Racial tensions began to escalate in York, Pennsylvania in 1963. Black citizens of York protested police violence and discrimination at City Hall. Their demands for a biracial police review board were turned down by the all-white City Council. Citizens continued to protest over the next few years and complained of police brutality and the use of police dogs to curb protests. During this time, the city saw the rise of several notorious all-white gangs. By the mid-1960s, York had become deeply racially divided, and in 1968, a series of white-on-black crimes incited retaliation in the form of fire, bombings, and street brawls. On July 17, 1969, with racial tensions at boiling point, a black youth who burned himself playing with lighter fluid blamed a local white gang known as the Girarders. That would later be revealed as a lie, but not before the pent-up resentments of the black community turned violent. That same day, 17-year-old Taka Nee Sweeney was shot by an unseen gunman when York City Police Detective George Smith stopped him and his friends for violating the city's youth curfew. White and black gangs began fighting that afternoon. 11 others were hurt when people in 6 blocks of the city reverted to rock throwing, barricading, and shooting from behind bushes and poles. Fighting lasted through the night and into the next day. 9 more people were injured, including Officer Henry C. Schad. Schad, a 22-year-old rookie with 11 months on the force, was struck by a bullet believed to have been fired by a black rioter while riding in one of the police department's 2 armored trucks. White gangs around the city prepared for revenge. Schad languished in the hospital for nearly 2 weeks before succumbing to his injuries. As Schad lay dying, racial tensions soared in the city. Fights broke out, buildings were set ablaze, and police began barricading black neighborhoods. More than 60 people were injured, 100 were arrested, and entire city blocks were burned. 8. New Orleans, 1866. The New Orleans race riot of 1866 occurred on July 30th when a peaceful demonstration of mostly black freedmen was set upon by a mob of white rioters, many of whom had been soldiers of the recently defeated Confederate States of America, leading to a full-scale mass killing. While the riot was typical of numerous racial conflicts during Reconstruction, this incident had special significance. It galvanized national opposition to the moderate Reconstruction policies of President Andrew Johnson and ushered in much more sweeping congressional Reconstruction in 1867. The riot took place outside the Mechanics Institute in New Orleans, as black and white delegates attended the Louisiana Constitutional Convention. The convention had reconvened because the Louisiana state legislature had recently passed the Black Codes and refused to extend voting rights to black men. Also, on May 12, 1866, 4 years of Union Army-imposed martial law ended, and Mayor John T. Monroe, who had headed city government before the Civil War, was reinstated as acting mayor. Monroe had been an active supporter of the Confederacy. As a delegation of 130 black New Orleans residents marched behind the U.S. flag toward the Mechanics Institute, Mayor Monroe organized and led a mob of ex-Confederates, white supremacists, and members of the New Orleans police force to the Institute to block their way. The mayor claimed their intent was to put down any unrest that may come from the convention, but the real reason was to prevent the delegates from meeting. As the delegation came to within a couple of blocks of the Institute, shots were fired, but the group was allowed to proceed to the meeting hall. Once they reached the Institute, the police and white mob members attacked them, beating some of the marchers while others rushed inside the building for safety. Now the police and mob surrounded the Institute and opened fire on the building, shooting indiscriminately into the windows. Then the mob rushed into the building and began to fire into the crowd of delegates. When the mob ran out of ammunition, they were beaten back by the delegates. The mob left the building, regrouped, and returned, breaking down the doors and again firing on the mostly unarmed delegates. As the firing continued, some delegates attempted to flee or surrender. Some of those who surrendered, mostly blacks, were killed on the spot. Those who ran were chased as the killing spread over several blocks around the Institute. By this point, both the rioters and victims included people who were never at the Institute. African Americans were shot on the street or pulled off of streetcars to be summarily beaten or killed. By the end of the mass killing, at least 200 Black Union War veterans were killed, including 40 delegates at the convention. Altogether, 238 people were killed and 46 were wounded. 9. Wilmington, Delaware, 1968. The Wilmington riot of 1968 occurred in Wilmington, Delaware, in April of that year, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In the wake of this assassination, on April 4, 1968, a large number of black youths converged on the main downtown business area of Wilmington and began looting stores from April 9 to 10, 1968. A report of sniper fire prompted Democratic Mayor Babiars to declare a state of emergency, to impose a curfew, and to request assistance from Governor Terry. The two-day riot that occurred after the assassination was small compared with riots in other cities, but its aftermath highlighted the depth of Wilmington's racial problem. The severity of the disorder in Wilmington following King's assassination is questionable. 21 buildings were destroyed by fire, 40 people were injured. 154 citizens were arrested, and arms caches were found. 10. Vicksburg, 1874. On this day in history, hundreds of African Americans were lynched for coming to the defense of the first black sheriff in a Mississippi county in 1874. It is one of the more shameful aspects of American history that has seemingly been forgotten amid this country's purported nationwide racial reckoning. The carnage was called the Vicksburg Race Riot, named for the town in which it took place. Vicksburg was part of Warren County Sheriff Peter Crosby's jurisdiction, but the racist white men living there didn't like having a black man as its top law enforcement officer and forcibly removed him. Crosby was a former slave and fought in the Union Army, which further enraged the group that the Vicksburg Post kindly referred to as an angry mob. When they were finished with Crosby, they went after Vicksburg's other black residents. The Zinn Education Project, a non-profit organization that promotes teaching history, estimated anywhere from 75 to 300 black people were killed. Following this brutal attack, federal troops were sent to Vicksburg and Mr. Crosby was appointed as sheriff again. However, in early 1875, a white man named J.P. Gilmer was hired to serve as Sheriff Crosby's deputy. After Sheriff Crosby tried to have Mr. Gilmer removed from office, Mr. Gilmer shot Sheriff Crosby in the head on June 7, 1875. Mr. Gilmer was arrested for the attempted assassination but never brought to trial. Mr. Crosby survived the shooting but never made a full recovery and had to serve the remainder of his term through a representative white citizen. We carry the stories of these lost cities in our hearts, not as ashes of despair, but as embers of possibility. For in remembering, we rebuild. In honoring, we heal. For the echoes of pain resonate not just in brick and mortar, but in the beating hearts of those who carry the stories of their ancestors. Though shadows of injustice darken the pages of history, the light of resistance shines brighter. These fallen cities stand not as monuments to defeat, but as defiant testaments to the strength of the human spirit. The flames may have consumed, but they could not extinguish the fire of community, the embers of creativity, the unyielding resilience of those who refuse to be erased. Let their stories be not of loss, but of the unyielding power of a people who rise, rebuild, and illuminate the path to a brighter tomorrow. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two from the content? Freely share your thoughts with us in the comment section, and we will be happy to respond. Also, don't forget to support our efforts by hitting the like button, share with families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to keep the channel growing if you are yet to. Thank you for watching.